mode.
All right, hello everyone and welcome to this month's Quality in Action webinar, part of the Mentoring Partnership of Minnesota's Quality in Action series. Our topic this month is Mentoring Program Evaluation, and we'll be featuring the Oregon Mentors Evaluation Toolkit. I am April Reardon. I'm the Director of Training and Community Partnerships here at the Mentoring Partnership of Minnesota. Just to cover a little bit of logistics as people are continuing to log in. This topic has been really popular, lots of registrations this month. But we do encourage you to participate in the webinar by asking questions and sharing your comments. There are a couple ways to do that with the GoToWebinar system. So you can, in your control panel, there's a little hand that you could click on. If you do that, then one of the MPM organizers will go ahead and unmute you. So if you are participating by phone or have a microphone and can just speak to us, we would love to be able to unmute you and hear your voice. Another option, because lots of people are just listening to the webinar through their speakers and maybe don't have that audio option of speaking, you can type questions and comments into the question section of that control panel as well and submit those. So if you have questions just for staff or something really specific, we can I just got a little update here that my app was showing my application is paused. So let me play. Now you can see the screen that I'm looking at. Thanks, Courtney. So you can go ahead and share those questions in that question panel. So these are a couple different ways to participate. Do ask questions or submit questions at any time. You can start typing them in and submitting them now, and we can save them to ask later. We do record webinars, and those are available on our YouTube channel after there's a little bit of time for us to get the recording, but then we upload that to our YouTube channel right away. The slides from today's presentation you can download from slideshare.net, and that link is included here at the end. What we also do is send a follow-up email to everyone who attends the webinar, so you'll get a link to the slides, also to any additional resources that come up during the webinar. Most of the resources that we talk about are really linked within these slides, so if you can get to the slides, you can get to all of the resources. We'll also share our panelists' email addresses in that follow-up email. So I might mention that again later, but if you're interested in contacting any of our panelists, that contact information will be included in that follow-up email. So today we've got a lot to cover. We're going to really looking at this mentor program evaluation. We've got some introductory pieces and just to review some best practices, but then really digging into and having a live demo of the Oregon Mentors Evaluation Toolkit, and particularly the different instruments that are available there, and hearing some tips for how to select the right instrument for your program. And then some notes about administering those instruments, and then like I said, we've got tons of resources that are here in these slides. So to get us started, in Minnesota, we have something called the Quality Mentoring Assessment Path that we've had lots of programs in Minnesota start to fill out, and so we wanted to look at and share a little bit about what our programs here in Minnesota measuring. And so I'm going to let Courtney tell us about the next few slides that show what programs in Minnesota are measuring. What are we evaluating when it comes to mentoring?
All right, well, thank you, April. The first couple slides here, we're just going to run through what different programs are measuring. So this first chart that'll pop up in just a second is about academic indicators. So on this we see that most programs are measuring grades or academic performance to some extent, and the highest category there is that 70% of our programs are measuring reading grades. And I think it's important to note here that many of the programs who completed the QMAP are actually just community-based mentoring programs, and they don't have any form of academic concentration or tutoring focused, but they still feel the need to measure grades. So if you look, pretty consistently high numbers that our programs are measuring academic performance. And then the next slide here, we'll see different behavioral indicators. Wait a second for that to pop up. And on here, so we see that fewer programs are measuring these behavioral outcomes, but we still have 70% of our programs are measuring their impact on youth substance use. Next one we'll see here is about psychological and social functioning. I think what's really interesting and actually encouraging here to note is that 100% of the programs who responded to this item in the QMAP reported measuring the quality of their match relationships, which is great to see because we know that if a mentee doesn't feel connected with their mentor, then any of the other benefits of mentoring, they really won't follow. So it's great to see that programs are taking that to heart and actually are measuring the quality of those relationships that they have in their programs. And this last chart here is kind of the punch for all the other slides. We see here that over half of our programs who responded to this item are measuring 20 or more of these different indicators of success. So mentoring programs are really measuring everything, and they're potentially even grasping at straws for different indicators for their programs that really aren't relevant to their program's mission or that they couldn't have an impact on, but they're just measuring everything possible for any different types of funders or people who are interested. So I think Michael maybe talk a little bit more about that later on today or have a comment for that.
Great. Thank you, Courtney. Yeah, I think that we wanted to show that a little bit to see, just to demonstrate that programs are really measuring everything, and that in our conversations leading up to this, and Mike Geringer is one of our panelists, might share that too, but there's kind of an attitude of let's measure everything and see what's there, which is, you know, all the big studies that we look to in mentoring have been impact studies that do look at, you know, lots of different domains and indicators and looking to see what does mentoring do, but that what we want to look at in this webinar too is that individual programs may need to be more focused with their evaluation, and you know, so this is just an interesting trend to see the number of different things that programs are measuring, which might answer the question as to why evaluation seems so overwhelming and daunting to programs. And you know, these are quality in action webinars, so we're always looking at best practices, but the elements of effective practice, one of the sections is really about ensuring that program quality and effectiveness, and they break it into a few different categories, but the one that this webinar will really focus more on is really about this plan to measure expected outcomes. We're not going to spend a lot of time today on the difference between process and outcome measurement, and not so much on this dissemination of findings and how to share those results. We will touch on some of those areas maybe indirectly, but our focus for the rest of the webinar is really about those outcomes for kids, or outcomes for young people. So the instrument toolkit will really hone in on how we can specify those expected outcomes, select appropriate instruments, and really think about that and implement an evaluation design. So now I am excited to introduce our panelists and really presenters. They're really going to take over and share a lot of this information for us. But like I said, we have Mike Geringer, and Resource Advisor for the National Mentoring Center at Education Northwest. Mike is an information services professional with extensive experience in developing and disseminating collections of education-related materials. He's been at Education Northwest for 13 years in various information services roles. As advisor with the National Mentoring Center, he provides mentoring programs nationwide, so you might recognize his name, but with information, consultation, and resources to assist in the development, improvement, and evaluation of their program practices. You'll also recognize his name. He's the author, co-author, or editor of numerous publications and guidebooks, including Foundations of Successful Mentoring, Youth Mentoring, ABCs of School-Based Mentoring, and Peer Mentoring, an introductory guide. He recently developed the YouthBuild Mentoring Operations Manual, a guidebook governing the mentoring model used in YouthBuild sites around the United States. And many of you probably know him because he currently serves as the administrator for the Mentoring Forums, which is a discussion forum with over 1,500 members. And we're also excited, our second presenter, hi Mike, our second, oops.
Hi everyone.
Also excited to have Celeste Jansen, who is a program director with Oregon Mentors, a state partnership similar to the Mentoring Partnership of Minnesota. Celeste began there in 2007 and works with over 150 youth development organizations in Oregon on trainings, evidence-based program practices, volunteer management, and mentor recruitment. We often share stories or call each other to get advice about different things that we do in our respective states. Celeste's experience with mentoring began in 1999 at her first nonprofit job, a YWCA with a mentoring program. She and her husband currently are mentoring a 14-year-old boy. And over the past 12 years, Celeste has worked in the nonprofit sector at the Oregon Center for Environmental Health, at Eagle Mount, and Breast Cancer Action, and the YWCA of UC Berkeley. And she's also a University of California at Berkeley alumna and a fellow in the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's Ladder to Leadership program at the Center for Creative Leadership. They're really well-accomplished panelists and presenters here. So welcome to both of you, and probably most importantly, they work together to develop the Oregon Mentors Evaluation Toolkit, which we'll get some background about in a moment. But we wanted to start by, well, Mike and Celeste wanted to start by finding out a little bit about who's participating today. So I have a couple polls to launch to find out about who's here. The first one is just they want a sense of what the experience of our attendees is in the mentoring field. So if you can respond to the poll, then we'll find out who is participating today. Probably just give it about 10 more seconds. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share those results with everyone. There we go. And what I forgot to mention, too, is that we also have Sarah Krummer from Friends for Youth, who is participating today. And I'll mention at the end of the slides, this is why I didn't have it triggered here, but offering this webinar again for the Friends for Youth webinar series on May 16th. So yes, Sarah, if you can say hello, that would be great. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that here.
That's okay. Hello, everyone.
All right, so we have a nice mix here, but it looks like people were a little slow to identify themselves as experts. I saw those came in a little bit later, but a good chunk who are new to the field and also, you know, a pretty good level of experience there. We have one more question that we wanted to ask now via the polls, just to see who's working with a professional evaluator, an outside evaluator for their mentoring program. So I'm going to launch that one now then too. And I'm going to close in just a second here. And I'll share. So the biggest chunk, along with our experienced crowd, it almost lines up there, but not using a professional evaluator. So this webinar becomes even more important probably, but even for those who are, it might help you in doing that. So at this point, Celeste and Mike, I'll jump over and show the evaluation toolkit while you tell us a little bit about how it came about, and then we'll keep moving forward. So welcome Mike Geringer and Celeste Jansen.
Thank you, April. I'm going to talk you through basically using the evaluation toolkit and how it was created and a little bit about logic models before I then introduce Michael and have Michael show you through the toolkit. The Evaluation Instrument Toolkit was created last fall, and that's because Oregon Mentors believes that evaluation is really a key area where state partnerships can provide technical assistance to support to mentoring programs, especially because so many mentoring programs aren't working with professional evaluators. Just like we saw in our poll, it looked like about 78% of you are not currently working with an evaluator when you add the two bottom columns. In the initial review of evaluation materials that I did, I found that there were a lot of different evaluation resources and a lot of things specifically on logic models and evaluation plans, but I didn't find any good resources on choosing appropriate instruments specific to mentoring. The one resource that is in that area that I did see was at the back of that JUMP manual that was created many years ago. And that resource is, first of all, not online, and second of all, it's now a bit dated. So last year, we hired the National Mentoring Center at Education Northwest to develop this resource. We provided certain specifications that we really wanted to see. First of all, we wanted to only include tools that were free. We understand that everyone has tight budgets, and we didn't want to list a bunch of instruments that were really expensive. We also wanted to include tools that were in the public domain. So basically, we wanted to find things that were available to the public and they're in other places, or we could get permission to post them on our site. We didn't want to have to tell a mentoring program you need to go to this academic journal that's only in a specific library and recommend any instruments that were not easy to access. Third, we really wanted tools that were both valid and reliable. That means tools that measure what they're supposed to measure and tools that give consistent results. We see many mentoring programs that we work with and creating their own instruments, and we have some concerns about how legitimate those homemade tools are and whether or not they're actually valid or reliable. While we were creating this, a side goal in the creation of this online toolkit was also to begin the process of understanding if certain tools are more popular and if those tools could slowly become the standard instruments that programs use, just as a way to help programs and to help funders so that there's not such chaos with so many different instruments and indicators being used. So we'd like to begin that conversation as more and more folks begin to use instruments that are in the toolkit. In our work, we see many mentoring programs that are asked about effectiveness, and they look solely at the youth's behavior or the youth's outcomes. So in the screen, in that fifth box, we know from David Dubois' 2002 meta-analysis that high-quality mentoring programs have the greatest positive effects on youth. So we created this model to talk about effectiveness in mentoring programs and what that really looks like, because it's so much more broad than just focusing on that fifth box. So let's walk through this slide. We know that how well you as a staff member run your program directly translates to how well the volunteers, or the mentors if they're paid staff, but how well the mentors mentor the youth. So there's a direct correlation there. Additionally, how well those mentors are working with the youth build then either high quality or low quality match relationships. So we need the volunteers to be working very effectively with youth in order for those high quality match relationships to develop. Only after those high quality match relationships have developed do we see the mentees' attitudes on certain topics changing. And so that's really the fourth step that we see and effectiveness. And then after those mentee attitudes have changed, do we then see the youth behaviors or the outcomes finally changing? So we think it's very important to not just measure that fifth box, but really to measure every step of how you're doing along the process. It's really important to note that you're not going to have high outcomes at the very end if the things aren't working well in any of the boxes of number 1 through 4. And in fact, we might even see negative outcomes. One way that evaluators talk about this is to talk about the difference between formative and summative evaluations. Formative evaluations provides information on what you can improve in your program. So that's basically the first box, or the boxes that are on the left-hand side. Summative evaluation measures the boxes that are more on the right side, and summative evaluation demonstrates the results of your program. And the easier way to think about that is if you're a cook and you're making soup. While you're making the soup, if you test it and you find out, oh, it needs more salt, well, that's you making some improvements on the earlier side, or the formative side. And when the guests are served the soup and it's done and you have the final taste, that's the very end, and that's the summative evaluation. So a good evaluation plan needs to include both summative and formative, or basically all stages of this continuum. So we're going to continue to talk about that concept in another way by looking at this diagram. Now, many of you have seen this diagram before. It comes from Jean Rhodes, and it's in the book Stand By Me. It's her model of conceptual mentoring. In this graphic, she talks about the pathways of mentoring influence. So she sees the mentoring relationship that's over there on the side, and that through building a mentoring relationship, a youth and adult build mutuality, trust, and empathy. And then those feelings then build different types of development, and she specified social, emotional, cognitive, and identity development. And those then go on to build positive outcomes. That's on the far right side. Mentoring programs and funders really always jump to look at those positive outcomes. But measuring relationship qualities and youth development can be a really powerful way to explain what's happening in a mentoring relationship, or alternately, what's not happening. So we believe that mentoring programs should evaluate the mentoring relationship itself, and it's great to see that so many programs in Minnesota are doing that. We believe that that's just so important to measure the mentoring relationship, because nothing else is possible if that first box doesn't have a good outcome. We also believe it's important to measure the key developmental areas that your program impacts, and I want to specify that's what your program impacts and not all of the areas, and we'll talk more about that later. And then at the very end, to also measure hard numbers, and that might be grades, behavior reports, arrests, or whatever it is that's applicable to your program. As a side note, that box along the bottom, moderators, are really great, valuable sources of information for mentoring programs, because you could look as moderators like variables, and so you could find out, wow, I have higher outcomes for let's say people with different interpersonal histories or different program practices. So those can be variables that you can find out have a significant effect on your positive outcomes. So to summarize, don't just think about evaluation in terms of, are your kids improving in grades or another area, but look for these missed opportunities in mentoring. First, service delivery. A great example that we often give of this is the Department of Ed evaluation, where a lot of us, when we saw the results, focused on outcomes. However, one of the really important things to note about that Department of Ed evaluation was that many of the youth in the mentoring programs received very few hours of mentoring. So they didn't necessarily get the service delivery that they were promised, and therefore the outcomes also weren't quite as strong. So quality and quantity of service delivery has a major impact. Second, participant satisfaction. This has a tremendous meaning in volunteer-driven mentoring programs particularly. Third, we match quality, and we've already discussed how strong matches really do make everything else possible. And then fourth, the intermediary outcomes are okay. That's the idea of it's okay to measure things like changes in attitudes instead of just changes in behavior. The little serenity prayer that we have on the right-hand side is a reminder, don't expect your program to do more than it can reasonably do. And think about that as you're creating your logic model and documents for evaluation planning. So to help you clarify this a little bit, let's look at a logic model. Okay, so we highly recommend that all programs create a logic model. And I want to explain that logic models vary. And if you're new to logic models, there is a great guide that's been put together by the Kellogg Foundation. They have not only a guide on evaluation and how to do an evaluation plan, but they have something called a logic model development guide. And I think we might even be trying to pull it up as well. Yeah. Over the next few slides, I'm going to talk specifically about logic models, and I'm going to look at the basic logic model. But there are many different types of logic models. And one example that I highly recommend is the theory of change logic model, which we're going through some of the screens from it. The theory of change logic model is a great way for programs to explain and to work through exactly how your program intends to make an impact on youth. So you could have a theory of change in your program that focuses on building resiliency or building assets or some other key core fundamental information that you really build your program on. And the theory of change is a great way to help you figure that out if you don't already have it. After you do a theory of change logic model, the Kellogg Foundation then recommends that you do a basic logic model. And let's pull that up back to our slides. April, could we pull up the slides again, the sample vacation logic model?
There's just a
Great.
little delay
Okay.
in getting
So
there.
Okay, great, thanks. This is a sample vacation logic model, and it comes from the Kellogg Foundation. This is, again, just a basic logic model. And many of you have seen something like this. Often funders ask us to submit logic models for grants. But there are things that most logic models ask you to put together some resources or inputs. So for planning a vacation, your logic model, your resources would say things like your holiday flight schedules, your family schedules, whatever the inputs you have. The activities that you would then go do for your sample vacation logic model might be create a family schedule, get holiday flight information. Outputs and outcomes are often confused, and the way that I distinguish between them are outputs are numbers. So for instance, there might be 4 tickets purchased or $2,000 saved. There's something where you look at the quantity of your activities. Many mentoring programs talk about outputs very easily in that you have 30 youth served and offer 6 trainings. Those are the type of outputs that are traditionally in mentoring logic models. Then let's look a little bit at outcomes. Outcomes are traditionally talked about as behavior or what people are experiencing. So that doesn't look as much at the numbers, but it looks at what are the behavior changes that folks should experience. And so on the sample vacation logic model, you hope that your outcomes are family members enjoy vacation. And at the end, the impact is that long-term impact. And here we see that for a vacation, that might be good family relations. So let's look at a sample logic model, not for vacation, but for mentoring. What we found when we do logic models for mentoring programs is the work that you directly do then impacts, of course, the work that the youth and mentor directly do. And sometimes it's hard to capture that all in one logic model. So in this sample logic model, it uses YouthBuild as an example, and we've broken out the differences between program and youth and mentors, and to show the difference that you do in your everyday work, and then also the activities and the outputs that we're expecting youth and mentors to achieve. So the statement of need is at the top, and the statement of need is a great place to just talk about what is it exactly that you're fulfilling as you create your mentoring program. Then below we see the 2 different sections for program and youth mentors. And then we see the resources, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impact. And because today we're going to be talking about indicators and tools, we've added a sample column to also talk about indicators and tools just to help you see how that could fit in to a logic model. what we want to point out, many of these things look familiar to you. So the activities are things like recruitment, screening, matching, training, things that you do in your everyday work. In YouthBuild, there's things called life plans, and so there's some specific things that are in this plan that you might not use. But what we want to also point out is that the indicators and tools column has information that has a lot of different data sources. So it's not just pre-post tests, but there's things like monthly reporting and match tracking logs and court records, things that are valuable sources of information that you can use in your evaluation plan and that are not specifically just the instruments that we're going to talk about, but really the data that's available to you in your mentoring program. I have one last comment. We've talked a lot about the importance it is to look not just at the youth outcomes, but to look at a variety of different data sources for how well you're running your program, how well is that match really building, and then whether or not the youth at the end are getting attitude and behavior changes. One important point, and the women from Minnesota both mentioned this, but many mentoring programs think about the PPV and Big Brothers Big Sisters impact study in 1995 as being the standard after which to offer evaluation. That was, however, an impact study. And that impact study is a special study that tests the program model and it looks at a wide variety of possible impacts. So it's kind of like the scientific equivalent of throwing everything you can think of against the kitchen wall and seeing what sticks. And unless you're working with an evaluator and you intend to study impact, this is not the type of evaluation you should be doing. Instead, it's important to think about your resources and to reasonably plan the specific measures and attitude changes and the specific behavior changes that your theory of change and your logic model lead you to believe that you can impact. So for example, in this YouthBuild logic model, we don't look at things like reading or teen pregnancy or things that they think this is not something that YouthBuild is going to necessarily impact. It might, but instead we've really built this sample logic model around things that are important to the YouthBuild program. And YouthBuild, if you're not familiar with it, has a theory of change that centers around giving job and future planning skills to youth. So therefore, in planning these skills, YouthBuild hopes youth to achieve very specific goals around their future and around their relationships. So we see things like reduce recidivism, better job placement, better financial management, things that are really key to the YouthBuild program. With that in mind, we'd like to do our last poll of the day talking about logic models. And can we pull that up? So the question is, my organization has an up-to-date logic model that illustrates the specific impact of mentored youth. And that's the specific impact of mentored youth in your program.
We've got about half the group who voted so far, so we'll give it a few more seconds to get some more votes in. There's a lot of options to choose from, so I don't want to rush anyone, but I'm going to close it in about 5 seconds here. Okay. It's an interesting mix. All right, we'll share now.
Okay, I'm not surprised at the results. It looks like many folks do use a logic model, but it could use some improvement. Many programs that I work with have used logic models that have not changed since the beginning of the program, even though the program has significantly changed. Or they might have different logic models for different funders and no one logic model. But also not surprisingly, 43%, or actually the majority of folks on this call, do not have a logic model. So again, I think at the end when we look at the resources, you'll find the information from the Kellogg Foundation, and that's a great place to start when thinking about developing a logic model. With that in mind, I'd like to bring Michael Geringer onto the line so that he can talk to you about the toolkit and walk you through what resources we have on the Oregon Minister's Evaluation Toolkit.
Thank you, Celeste.
Great. Thanks, Celeste, and good afternoon, everybody. Before I start doing like a live demonstration of the toolkit itself, I wanted to talk just very briefly about tips for selecting good instruments. And you can find these tips and others on the website of the toolkit itself. We included a little section of kind of advice on how to use it. As Celeste mentioned early on in the webinar today, try and use instruments that have been tested for reliability and validity. You may have a homegrown instrument that you think is capturing what you need to capture, but the instruments that we've added to that toolkit have all been through statistical testing. They've been proven in previous research efforts to give reliable answers and to be a valid measure of what it is you're trying to measure. As Celeste just noted, make sure that you're measuring things that fit your logic model, and not just in terms of narrowing your focus, but also in terms of the time element. A lot of times, youth's participation in mentoring programs is a year or even shorter, a school year. And yet you'll see mentoring programs trying to measure like these hugely impactful changes in the youth's behavior or the way the young person is thinking about something. And one of my favorite quotes in mentoring, I can't even remember where I heard this the first time, but is that mentoring is more like the slow accumulation of an avalanche starting to gain momentum and heading down the hill. It's not the crack of a baseball off a bat for a home run. And so I think when you're trying to decide what to measure and what instruments to bring into your evaluation, think about the time element. Can we reasonably expect to see the change we're looking for in the 9 months of our school-based program or the year and a half of this community-based match? So try and think about the time element. Note the complexity of the tool, the age range that it was originally designed for, the reading level. This can have a huge impact on the quality of your results if the young people can't understand the question they're being asked, or if some of them ask you for the definition of a word, for example, but others don't. You're kind of starting to muddy the waters in terms of the quality of the data you're getting. And also conceptual things. I think the younger the mentees are, the harder it is for them to both recognize and express feelings that they're having, thoughts that they're having, complex emotions. So really think about that type of thing when selecting tools. And then this last point, I think, is almost the most important, and that's to do everything you can to try and have a comparison group of students or young people to compare your results to. The reason for this is without a comparison group, you really don't know what your results say. You can do a pre-post test and say, the self-esteem of your mentees is higher. There's an example here on the slide. The line is going up, and there's a difference pre-post test. But, on the example down below, if there's a comparison group, you can see if your mentees are doing better or worse than other students. Now, things like the Big Brothers Big Sisters study or the Department of Education study Celeste mentioned, those are research efforts involving thousands of students. Now, obviously, none of your mentoring programs have thousands of students in them, so that kind of limits your ability to do what's called power statistical analysis, where you have so many students participating that you're able to do a lot of statistical work and try and see what are the statistically significant changes between the mentored and non-mentored students. But there are creative ways that you can come up with other types of comparison groups. There's what's called a matched comparison group, where if you have 30 mentees, you try and find 30 young people that are not being mentored that match your mentees in as many ways as they possibly could, so that it's not a true comparison group. It's not a true gold standard kind of, quasi-experimental design on your evaluation, but you at least have a reasonable group of similar young people to compare your results to. Now, this can be especially critical around things like substance use rates. Without a comparison group, you may find that if you say have a middle school focused mentoring program, you may find at the end of 2 years in your program, the kids are smoking more pot, for example. That might be a very disconcerting finding on its own, but if you can compare them to the general student body at, say, the school, you might find that they're smoking far less pot than the general population. So always keep in mind that when you're designing an evaluation, try and build in some kind of comparison group, because otherwise you have results, but they're results without context. So just some tips there to keep in mind. April, if you want to throw the controls here over to me, I'd be happy to show off the toolkit to folks here. Okay. All right. So the first thing I want to show off is just kind of the basic structure of the instrument toolkit. This is the home page here. If you scroll down a little bit, you'll see kind of these three main links. There's the tips I just mentioned for using the instrument toolkit. There's a lot of good information in there. I just covered a fraction of what you'll find in there. The second link is browse for specific instruments. We'll be going there in a second. That provides you a list of the instruments kind of broken down by keyword. There's also a link here you'll see that shows you everything. There's almost 70 instruments in the toolkit now. It'll be growing over time. So if you just want to see a list of all 68 of them or whatever, you can click that link. We've also provided some links to other online instrument collections, and I'm not going to show you these today, but these are some of the sources that I pulled instruments from. So if you don't find what you're looking for in this toolkit, we've provided links to some of the other big kinds of repositories of evaluation instruments. Now, many of those have instruments that are not free, or that you would have to jump through some kind of hoop to use the instrument. But just so you know, if you want to measure something very specific and maybe a little bit off the beaten path, there are collections out there with thousands of instruments in them. But as Celeste noted, it's easy to get kind of lost in the jungle there, so to speak. So what we've tried to do at this site is really hand select instruments that I thought spoke well to the types of things that mentoring programs are trying to do around the country. So let's go ahead and look at this listing of keywords. And think of these as just keywords that these instruments have been tagged with. We've come up with 19 separate domains or keywords, if you will. You'll find instruments listed in more than one. If a survey has questions about the youth's attitudes about school, but also their attitudes about their home life, you might find that listed in a couple of different categories here. So don't be surprised if you see things listed under more than one keyword. That was intentional. I'll just very quickly show you, if you click on any of these categories, you wind up getting a listing of all the different instruments that are in it. You'll see in this career and vocational category, there's about 8 instruments in here. And then if you click on any instrument's record here, so to speak, you get kind of this full display of information where we've provided a description. You can see other keywords that we've attached to that, and if you click any of those, you'll go to that section. Where to download it, and for each thing here, we've provided a link. Some of them are hosted on the Oregon Mentors website. Others we're just linking to where you can find them online. If there's any requirements for use, sometimes the researcher kind of wants to know who's using their tool, but most of these things don't have any fees or requirements. I also noted the age range that the instrument was originally developed for. Now that doesn't mean you couldn't use it with a different age range, but you want to be very careful about not to reword questions or to kind of change the order of things. That type of monkeying with a survey tends to destroy the reliability and validity, which makes it a good tool in the first place. I also tried to include, where I could find it, information on how to administer and score these tools. Most of the instruments in here are simple Likert scale surveys where the youth is responding on some kind of 4 or 5 point scale of I agree, to strongly disagree, or you know, just something that kind of provides a range for them to respond to. Sometimes they're even yes/no questions. But, you know, I tried to indicate if some of them need to be reverse scored, or if certain questions add up to make a scale that measures a particular thing. I tried to just basically give as much information as possible to help you actually use the tool. I mean, handing the students a survey and saying fill this out is easy. Knowing what to do with the data you get back is where things get complicated. So we really tried to include as much of that as possible. And then the source. If you have further questions about a particular instrument, we tried to provide contact information for the researcher or organization that originally developed it. So that's kind of the basic structure of what you'll find in the toolkit. I think what I'd like to do for the rest of our time here is just kind of walk you through some of these sections and maybe highlight some of the things that will give you a jump start on perusing what we've provided here. The first category I want to really focus on is what we called comprehensive multi-domain surveys. And this was these are surveys that have lots of questions. Some of them have literally 200 questions in them, hence the term comprehensive. And they tend to ask questions about a lot of different things. Some of them, you know, have questions about school or their home life or drug use or violence or bullying. It's a whole gamut of things. I really am a big fan of these as a starting point for kind of getting into the instrument toolkit, because a lot of them have subscales that you can just kind of pull out of the larger instrument and use. So I would never recommend giving your mentees some 200-question survey, but you know, if you find here's a set of 8 questions around drug use and we like them, chances are you can pull those out of this larger instrument and score them separately. And so I like these things as a good way of kind of getting an initial handle on the types of questions you might want to ask as part of your evaluation. I'll just show you off a couple of these here. The first one is the Youth Outcome Survey.
Hey,
and this
Mike.
is one that actually, yes.
Before we start going into some of these surveys, we do have a question here from Linda. And she's asking, is it valid to use different tools for different age groups in your program, or do we need to use the same instrument for all youth in the program?
Well, I mean, I think depends on the age range that you're serving. I wouldn't give the same survey to a 5th grader that I'm giving to a high school senior. You're probably not going to be looking or expecting to find the same types of outcomes for those different mentees. So you may want to come up with different versions of things. Yeah, that's kind of really just dependent on the age range you're serving. Some of the tools, in fact, one in particular I was going to show in just a minute, does come in different versions for different age ranges. There's like an elementary, middle school, and high school version. So some of them actually provide that for you already. But I would say, you know, yeah, if you're serving like a very wide age range, you would probably want to vary the tools and maybe make some kind of cutoff point where, you know, starting in high school for those matches we'll use this instrument. Anyone younger than that will use this one. It kind of depends on what you want to measure and the age range of that. So the first instrument here I just wanted to show off is the Youth Outcomes Survey. This is actually the tool the Big Brothers Big Sisters has used for a long time. They were nice enough to let us share it with you through the instrument toolkit. And you'll notice it's divided into several questions, sets of questions about yourself, about how the youth feels about school, teachers, future planning, how they feel they're doing in particular school subjects. There's a set of questions on skipping school, drug use. So this is a good kind of example of, kind of the multi-question, multi-domain aspect of some of these tools. Another one that's a lot bigger is the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance System, which is a very kind of ominous sounding name. This is one of those big 100+ question surveys. I just pulled up a page here from it. This asks questions about bullying, suicide attempts, then it goes into tobacco use, on and on and on. This is a great survey because I'll show you there's a website where they actually make all of the data from all of the previous years that this has been filled out nationally. This is a Centers for Disease Control survey. And what they do is they make all of the data nationwide available. And you can see here they have breakdowns of it by particular risk behaviors, by gender, by ethnicity. And down below here you can actually see they make the data files available. So going back to that idea of having a comparison group, this is a place where you can get your hands on national data. I think you can even break it down by state. So you can say, you know, here's how our mentees are doing compared to other youth nationally, or similar youth here in our state. Now those aren't an ideal comparison group, but it's better than nothing. So for some of these large multi-domain tools, look and see if we've noted whether there is comparison data available, because that can really help, especially if you're working with a professional evaluator who can work with these data files. Now in preparing for this, one thing I noticed about the YRBSS here is that most of the questions it asks would not be good for use in a pre-post way. They ask things like, have you ever thought about committing suicide? Well, if you have, the answer to that is not going to change pre-post. But there are other tools in kind of that multi-domain arena, such as the Substance Abuse Risk Protective Factors survey. This one asks questions such as, during the last 4 weeks, how many days of school have you missed? Or during the last month, how many times have you consumed alcohol? Those are answers that could change over time. So when you're looking at some of these, kind of take note as to whether the types of questions would be good in a pre-post context, or whether they're mostly good for just setting a baseline when young people enter your program. You take note of that, because if you're looking to use them in a pre-post way, the question has to be worded in a way that you could expect to see some kind of change, or that the question would get at some kind of change over time. The other kind of category that I want to focus on next here is connectedness, which is a concept we all understand, and we found 4 surveys that kind of get at ideas of connectedness. One in particular, this Hemingway scale of adolescent connectedness. I really want to highlight this. I'm a huge fan of this tool. It was developed by a colleague of mine, Michael Karcher, at University of Texas, San Antonio, and this basically measures youth's feelings of connectedness to several domains. Their self, which is kind of, think about as kind of their self-ideation, their self-esteem, their school, their friends, their family. For the high school age version, there's also connectedness to reading, connectedness to neighborhood, connectedness to self in the future, which is kind of goal setting and planning. And what I really like about this tool especially is that it views connectedness not just through a simple concept like, oh, I feel bonded to you, but it thinks of connectedness as kind of an active thing. I'm seeking out support from the things that I'm connected to. So it's a very active and engaged way of thinking about the concept of connectedness, and I really like it for that reason. I'll just show you very quickly the website where you can get that from, adolescentconnectedness.com. You'll see the surveys available as a short or long version. There's a Spanish, French, Mandarin, Chinese versions available. There's the complete manual, which explains the theory behind it. And actually it even includes the syntax for if you're working with an evaluator using the SPSS statistical software program. It even provides the syntax so that your evaluator can crunch the numbers very easily and pull good results out. So I highly recommend that one. Another domain that I wanted to kind of show off today was school and academics. And I saw at the beginning here, many of you are looking at grades, attendance, other school-related things. You know, I'm a big fan of looking at things like attitudes and beliefs around school, because there are so many things that go into grades going up or down. And even if you find that your mentees are doing better in school in hard numbers things like grades or test scores, it can be kind of hard to attribute that to your mentoring program. Is that the result of a tutoring program at the school? Did something else change in these kids' lives that's making school work more or less for them? So I encourage programs to look at things like attitudes, educational expectations and aspirations is one of the scales we've included here. I'll go ahead and just show that to you real quick. This is a very simple 5-question survey. How likely is it that you'll attend a vocational school or join the armed forces or go to a 2- or a 4-year college, graduate school? A lot of times I think young people in mentoring programs can't see themselves moving on in their lives in these ways. And so if you can move a young person from I probably won't to definitely will, then you've done a tremendous service for that young person. That may not result in their grades immediately going up within the school year that you're measuring, but at least you've kind of flipped the script, so to speak, on the way they're thinking about their future. Similar to that, I'll show you real quickly the Motivated Strategies for Learning questionnaire. Excuse me. A lot of, I think what mentoring programs are trying to impact is how the young person thinks about school. Are they motivated? So this asks questions on a 7-point scale. Things like compared with other students in this class, I expect to do well. I'm certain I can understand the ideas taught in this course. I have an uneasy, upset feeling when I take a test. Once again, these are all, if you can improve these types of internal thought processes for a young person, that's kind of the short-term impact that I think will lead to long-term academic improvements. The quality of their school, what their home life is like, whether there are other academic supports available, these are all things that will impact whether grades actually go up or down. But if you can show that your mentoring program is impacting these types of conceptual things in the minds of your mentees, to me, that's the type of academic improvement that I would expect to see from a mentoring program. Just a couple more categories of instruments here real quick that I wanted to show. We have a lot around personal attitudes and beliefs. This has probably 20 or 30 separate things in here. Most of these instruments measure some kind of attitude or belief. Make sure you're clear in your evaluation design whether you want to measure attitudes or about something or actual behaviors around something. Asking a youth, their attitudes about alcohol is a lot different than asking them, have you been drinking lately? Those are two different things. So kind of try and bring some clarity to your evaluation around that. I'll just show a couple of things here. A goal-setting skills scale, once again, if you can change how your young people are thinking about setting goals, planning for their future, these are all very important impacts. There's also a decision-making skills scale. This was developed by the same researcher, which is why it looks very similar. Decision-making, I think, is one of the best things a mentor can help influence for a mentee. You'll go back to Gene Rhodes' model, you'll see that first developmental area is cognitive development, literally helping with their thought process around things. I was at a conference a few weeks ago where they had a bunch of former gang members come in and talk about their mentoring experience, and almost to a person, they all said the thing that their mentor had done most for them is that when violence erupted in their community, it used to be they would just go grab their gun and head out to the streets and go looking for somebody to shoot. Now they stop. They think about it. They think about the consequences of their actions. And to me, that really drove home the way a mentor can help rewire the way a young person thinks about things. Just very quickly, I know we're short on time here. I'm glad to see that most of you are measuring aspects of your mentoring relationships, the quality of those relationships, because as Celeste said, that's a precursor to every other outcome that you're going to try and achieve. Just to highlight a couple of tools here, there's the Matched Characteristics Questionnaire and the Youth Mentoring Survey. These are companion instruments developed by a couple of researchers named Mike Nuccola and John Harris. They actually have a website where you can get these. It's just mentoringevaluation.com. For these tools, they're free to use. You just have to ask permission from them, and they'll send you the files. What they ask for in return is that you send them, once you've collected the data, they want you to send them the data that you have anonymously with your kids' identifying information stripped out. That's helping them further refine and validate these instruments. To me, there are a couple of really great surveys. I highly recommend them. And sharing your anonymous data is I think, a reasonable request to thank them for providing these materials. The other one I'm just going to quickly show here is a tool called Measuring the Quality of Mentor-Youth Relationships. This is a survey that we at the National Mentoring Center, in collaboration with Public-Private Ventures, developed many years ago. It's a simple 20-question survey for the mentee to fill out. It's asking, do I feel like I have a voice in what we do in the match? Do I feel I can trust my mentor? Am I bored when I hang out with my mentor? And this is a great way of seeing not only which matches may have red flags that you need to kind of do a little bit of extra support for, but it's also a good way of seeing kind of across the board, is our program creating matches that have that mutuality, trust, and empathy, that if you go back to Gene Rhodes' model, that's that first box, and nothing else good in your program is going to happen unless they are bonding in that way. So this is another free instrument that you can use to measure that kind of thing. April, if you want to take us back to the slides, just very quickly, we had some tips for administering instruments. Plan for problems. A lot of, it can be hard to get data out of schools. You may not get permission slips back from parents, so kind of build in some contingency planning whenever you go to administer a survey. Don't handpick or reword questions. If you see a set of 5 questions that's a scale on goal setting, don't pick 2 of them. You have to use all 5. That's what makes it reliable. Provide a private space to administer these instruments and administer them in a consistent and uniform way. Don't let one batch of kids fill them out in a classroom while the other batch takes them home over the weekend. Obviously, that's going to influence the answers you get. And lastly, plan for data storage and safety. If you're collecting information about young people, you have a responsibility to make sure it's secure. So what computer is it going to be on? Who can access that computer? What are we doing to encrypt it or keep it password protected? So think about those types of things before you start having youth fill out surveys. So that's about all I had for today. If folks have questions, I'd be happy to stick around here and answer questions either about the toolkit or anything else around evaluation.
Great. Thanks, Mike. We do have a lot of people who are still here and actually very attentive. So we are a few minutes past 1, but I have chatted with everyone that we will continue and can attend to some more questions. So please do raise your hand, or if you have a question that you haven't submitted yet, this is a great time to do that while we still have Celeste and Mike here, as well as all the other participants. I'm going to click through some of our resources just while I give you a minute to submit those questions, just so you can see what else is here. When you get the link to download these slides, you'll be able to see what else you can find. Obviously, there'll be a link to the evaluation instrument homepage and that toolkit from Oregon Mentors. You can check out some other resources from the Oregon Mentors as well. I also included a link to Education Northwest and the National Mentoring Center, specifically here with the mentoring program evaluation resources featured, because there are a lot of things listed there. Oops, I didn't mean to go there. Okay, and also the mentoring forums, which we mentioned that Mike is overseeing that, but there is a program evaluation section there as well if you're looking at finding some additional information. Those Kellogg Foundation resources that Celeste and Mike have mentioned, the Evaluation Handbook and the Logic Model Development Guide. If you haven't read Stand By Me, The Risks and Rewards of Mentoring Today's Youth, there's some information there. That's where that conceptual model is coming from. And, oh, it looks like my application was paused. Okay, here we go. I want to make sure everybody can see that. And there's a whole bunch of handouts that Mike and Celeste, when they've done this workshop in person, and I was fortunate to sit in on it at the Friends for Youth conference in California, but there's a whole bunch of handouts that they had sent my way. So if, other than handout number 2, the rest of them have all been uploaded to the same site where you can download our slides from today, and so you can find all of those handouts there, and then this handout number 2, you can directly link to that online. Courtney, do we have a question?
We have 2 questions in here. The first one's from Kevin, and he says, as a new director and going to implement some of these surveys, what do we do when a question is answered not in a positive manner? For instance, when my mentor gives me advice, I feel stupid, and the answer always, or something like that, what's my responsibility? So do you do follow-up when you get those answers on your evaluation, or how do you handle those instances?
Yeah, I would definitely say, especially if you're using some kind of like match characteristics or relationship quality tool, you know, it's kind of up to you to explain to mentors or youth how you'll use those. I wouldn't tell the youth, you know, the way you fill this out is I may follow up with you if it looks like you're in trouble. Young people tend to kind of give adults what they want to hear. So I wouldn't share any information with them beforehand like, you know, I'll follow up with you if something seems awful. But I do think if you get a survey back and you find an answer like that, then yes, that's a match that's probably very at risk for early termination, or just simply a match that's not going to be very effective. And I think at that point you need to jump in and provide, perhaps the mentor needs additional training around how to kind of talk with the youth about areas of improvement from a strengths-based perspective, and not, you know, look, one of the biggest problems we have in mentoring programs is mentors that come in and have this attitude, I'm going to fix this young person and I'm going to whip you into shape, kind of, and I think that's a common challenge, is trying to get volunteers to tone it down a little bit and just be supportive and kind of meet the young person where they're at. So I would say if you get that type of response back to something, then yes, that's a red flag that you need to step in, maybe give the mentor a little bit more training, and also make sure that that young person is still feeling positive about the experience, you know, because the last thing you want are matches that are failing or youth that are just simply leaving the program. That doesn't do anybody any good.
I'd also just like to reiterate the entire point of having those formative evaluations is to be able to look at your program as it's happening and make mid-course corrections. So it's absolutely makes sense to look at the results and adjust your results as you see that your program needs to make those adjustments.
Yeah, and when we showed that elements of effective practice slide earlier on, I mean, there were parts about coming up with that evaluation plan and sort of how do you use the results of your evaluation, and we didn't focus a lot on that today, but yeah, just to echo exactly what Celeste said.
Thanks. We also have another question here from Henry, and he's talking more specifically about his program goals. And he says, the goals of our program are to increase youth awareness of nature outdoors, that is not book understanding, but nature awareness out in the field. Can I use an existing instrument as a guide to create questions that measure increased nature awareness, or do you know of an instrument that measures this sort of thing?
Yeah, Henry, you know, when I was going through some of the existing instrument collections and kind of handpicking what to include for Oregon mentors, I did come across a survey or a couple of things that were designed for outdoor schools. And I don't remember where I saw those, but if you want, I can go ahead and do some poking around and see if I can come up with those. And I think they've asked some basic questions around ecology, so there were probably questions around, you know, resource conservation. I don't know if they were specifically asking around, you know, species identification or things like that, but they were definitely for measuring young people's increased knowledge of, you know, the types of things that outdoor school would be teaching. I also found other instruments that could be used to measure things around like service learning projects, and a lot of those had kind of cleanup or recycling, or you know, there'll be things like cleaning up a watershed, for example. So let me do some poking around, and I'll go ahead and if I don't, you know, if I can't get your email from April, I'll just send those things to April when I find them, and she'll pass them on.
Great. That's what makes Mike Carringer wonderful. I will, as just a reminder too, you'll have Mike and Celeste, they are gracious enough to share their contact information. You'll have their email addresses in the follow-up email that you'll receive later this afternoon, along with a link to these slides and any other things that have come up here. Sarah, did you want to mention just that what the webinar on May 16th, or do say a little bit more about that then?
Yeah, I think we're, this is another, I think this is our second collaborative work webinar. April and I are coming up with a couple topics every year that we're both addressing, and so we'll be going through pretty much the same presentation. I may say a few other words about Friends for Youth evaluation tool that we've been using, that we had developed specifically for our program. But otherwise, it will be the same thing. So if you think of some more questions or you want to review some of the materials, please join us on Monday, May 16th from 10 to 11:15 Pacific time, which is the same time as this webinar today. Thanks, April.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you so much, Celeste and Mike. It looks like we've got some thank you messages, but no additional questions. So, but participants have been very attentive, and it is almost 1:15. So, I think we'll go ahead and wrap up and let our presenters leave the webinar as well. Celeste, the Oregon Mentors, just had their conference yesterday as well, so she's ready to take a breather, I think. And again, you know, just thank you for participating, especially considering the busy week that you've had. And they just have been a dream to work with, incredibly thoughtful, and really excited about presenting this for you. So we will stop the recording, and this will be available on YouTube. You can check it out through Friends for Youth, and do use the evaluation toolkit for your programs. And as always, contact the Mentoring Partnership. You can contact me for more assistance with coming up with that evaluation plan and working through those logic models and things as well. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next month.
Take
Thanks,
care.
April.